You're hard pressed to find in Scripture someone who God used in a powerful way who is not the most unlikely person to be used. And we look at Gen Z and we can say there's so many things that could make them feel like an unlikely candidate to be used by God. And that's why God is going to use them in such a powerful, powerful way.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello once again, and welcome to the Mission Matters podcast. I'm Matthew Ellison, and you know what I'm going to say. I am joined by my good friend and co-host, Ted Essler. Ted, greetings, brother.
Hey, good to be on a call with you again. This has been a lot of fun doing this, and I really appreciate you.
Yeah, likewise, my friend. Well, why don't you introduce our guest and the topic at hand?
All right. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jolene Erlacher. And Jolene, let me just say I've really appreciated how you have invested in the Great Commission community over the years and participated in so many things that I'm at. We've actually never really spent a lot of time together or had the opportunity to talk about Gen Z, which is our topic today and something you care a lot about. Jolene is the CEO and president, and we were kind of chuckling before we started the recording about these ministry titles. So she's the big dog at Leading Tomorrow, where she is a trainer and consultant, and she helps organizations and ministries think about issues related to Gen Z. So Jolene, first of all, just thank you, and it's great to have you on the call today.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's great to be a part of this conversation.
Well, let me kind of kick this off, kind of frame our conversation. I was on a phone call, I guess it was last week, with a mission agency executive, and we were talking about mobilization and recruitment. And then we got on to talking about Gen Z. And at one point in the phone call, he said, I just wonder if God's going to skip a generation here. And he's struggling and wrestling with all of the change, all of the differences between his generational cohort and what he sees coming up through the ranks. And he's feeling a lack of elasticity and ability to make the transition. And so just to kind of frame this up, I think there is some struggle going out there that is generationally motivated. When we talk about Gen Z, just give us a snapshot from your perspective of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so with generations, people tend to differ a little bit on the exact age range, but roughly Gen Z are those born 1996 to around 2010. So really our students today, middle school, some elementary, middle school, high school, college students, and then recent graduates. So really roughly those 28, 27 and younger. There's some really interesting things that are defining this generation. And I think one of them is that many people agree they're the first post-Christian generation in America. So when you're talking with ministry leaders, we're all feeling that, right? This is a very different generation growing up in a very different context, in addition to all the other factors that are kind of setting them apart. So really, this generation is very unique in many ways. And they're the next wave that's coming into all of our organizations and agencies. So they're right there on that cusp right now.
What are some characteristics, you hit on a few of them, but maybe you can dive deeper into that makes this generation unique?
Yeah, I think there's a couple, especially as we think about engaging them in ministry and missions contexts, that are really interesting. One of the key traits is the fact that this generation is the most individualistic generation that we've seen, maybe ever in the history of America, North America, which is saying a lot because Western cultures tend to be more individualistic, as we all know. So now to have a very individualistic generation coming out of this culture is really unique. It's also impacting, as we're seeing globally, similarities among Gen Z globally because of technology. It's creating a lot of disconnect in other cultures that might have a more collectivistic, bent. So individualism is truly, I would say, one of the most stark traits. And they view themselves as an individual, who gets to really decide a lot about themselves and their experience, their identity. They also want to be valued as an individual. So this is having a lot of ramifications as far as, when you're part of a team, you're joining an organization, that desire to be seen and valued as an individual for their individual characteristics, traits, skills, giftings. Can be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. The other thing that I would say is very unique and different is how they perceive reality or truth. So in the past, we would have defined truth or reality more based on things like facts, logic, and reason. We would have said proof is reality, right? If you can prove something, it's true, which is why we put so much effort into proving the Bible is true, or, proving the path to salvation. You think of things that were very logical approaches to evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
For the younger generation, they've been taught to really value their individual and unique emotions, stories, and experiences, and that their emotion, stories, and experiences are what define reality. Therefore, perception is reality. I was just speaking at a conference last week where we were really discussing this, how it can be really difficult to respond to perceptions that are very individual and unique. So I would say those are the two traits that are really impacting mobilization, retention a lot. It's just that individualism and then that reliance on emotion, story, and experience or more subjective views of reality.
So when I hear you say that, what I think is when I think about particularly people in the leadership class of missions, whether that's a mission pastor or whether that's somebody in an agency organization, they hear those two things and they're thinking, well, those aren't Christian values. Do we need to teach and train them to correct them?
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard that expressed in
Yeah.
numerous different environments. What's your response to that?
Yes. I would say that God is a God of redemption. So how do we see God redeeming these characteristics? I am a firm believer that every generation is imprinted with what God needs to propel his kingdom forward in that moment in history. So there are characteristics that are in Gen Z that he has put there. They are for such a time as this. And I can see how in certain instances, how God is redeeming these things. So for example, with individualism, absolutely. Self-focus is not biblical. Being, me defining my own truth is not biblical. And yet, it is biblical that God has uniquely designed each of us to play a role in the body of believers, that he has gifted us and equipped us in a unique manner. And so there's an opportunity here to really affirm the giftings and the callings in the individuals who are right around us. And what we find is as we value them, hear them, coach them, train them, mentor them as individuals, we see them growing into the ability to participate in a selfless, God honoring manner. So really stepping into that individualism and saying, God, how do we redeem this? Another thing that comes up a lot is FOMO, the fear of missing out. And I don't want to miss out on other opportunities. And often deciding to go into missions or ministry is really terrifying because it means choosing a path that's going to lead to me missing out on other things. But how we see God redeeming FOMO or that fear of missing out is in the form of stewardship. This is a generation that does not want to waste time or resources or technology or energy. They want to truly steward the resources, the talents, the time that they've been given in a really specific and godly way. So you see God redeeming some of those things for his purposes in this time. So I think if we can look at it that way, yes, every generation has traits that are unbiblical, but God redeems those for the moment of time in which he calls us to serve his kingdom.
Jolene, I imagine our viewers and listeners, some of them are intimidated by this possibility. You mentioned opportunity. What approaches are effective? I mean, what does it look like to mobilize these, this special, unique generation that you just described?
Yeah, this gives me a lot of hope as well. Because in the past, I feel like we had to have education, experience, titles in order to have influence to call someone, to mobilize them, to energize them. The power today is that young people are making decisions based on their experiences, their conversations, the way that they feel after they have a conversation with someone. So that authentic leadership is becoming very, very important. Just being able to share our stories and to authentically engage with young people. So really today, anyone is equipped to be a mobilizer. I just did a study. We surveyed 200 young people who are considering or pursuing missions as a career path. And one of the key things that mobilizes young people is friends and family. It was actually number one and number two on two different studies that we just did in the last few years. And so, family and friends, those relationships, those authentic relationships where there's trust, where someone is sharing my story, where I'm participating with them, is so, so powerful. So, really, coming alongside individuals and really engaging in their story and their experience becomes critical. So I would say some of the key approaches then are just modeling that authentic leadership and really engaging intentionally in individual relationships with people around us. Every single one of us can do this. So, who are the 3 or 4 young people in our lives where we see God stirring them, calling them, gifting them? And how do we speak belief? That's another thing that just keeps coming out as young people. They want to know someone believes in them. And so, when we can look at a young person and say, I see God's gifting in your life, and I believe in what you can do for the kingdom of God. So those are some things, just that individual influence is so powerful today. And I think every single one of us has an opportunity to use that. Within agencies, we're sometimes designed to operate with programs. We have training programs, onboarding programs, member care programs. And what we're seeing is just this need to kind of shift to more of a one-on-one individualized approach in our mobilization, training, onboarding, recruiting, retention, all of those efforts, because it is really, really the most effective when we're engaging them individually or in small groups or communities.
Yeah. So there's a few things you haven't said yet, but I feel like you probably have a lot to say about them. One would be anti-institutionalization, which is kind of gripping our whole culture in one sense.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't use the word diversity.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of mission contexts that I'm in, when they talk about Gen Z, colonialism comes up as a primary topic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just out of curiosity, I mean, you could talk about any one of those, but when you talk about the biggest attributes, you didn't mention those 3, which I feel like agency leaders particularly, maybe not as much church leaders, but agency leaders are dealing with questions in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would juxtapose individualism and institutionalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they value the individual
Yeah.
over an institution. And this is where we're finding that the person who engages them as an individual is likely to mobilize and recruit them for an institution. They follow individuals much more than they'll follow an institution. So this is definitely a shift. And really, how do we equip our mobilizers, everyone within our organizations, to not look at filling slots, but engaging people? I was recently talking to a young couple who had, engaged with mobilizers at like 4 or 5 different agencies. And they said the ones we went with are the ones who said, we want you, John and Gabby. I'm making up names, right? But John and Gabby, for our organization. We see how God has gifted you. We believe in what God has for your lives. They're like, the other ones we're talking about, we have this role we need to fill. We have this position that needs someone. And so they were talking about the institution's needs versus the gifting or calling on the individual. So that is definitely a shift that needs to occur. The other thing, when I talked about emotion, story, and experience, part of that is they are an including generation. They're somewhat one of in a recent survey, someone called it, we're an include everyone generation, right? They want everyone to be included in this process, which is a powerful way to communicate the message of missions globally. There are people who are not included in this yet, and we need to include them. So that value on diversity comes out in that desire to include everyone. And so they want to see that. They want to see that in our language. They want to see that in our practices. And I think it's really powerful as we're communicating the message to frame it in that way. We are an include everyone, we're on an include everyone mission for the gospel. So,
Jolene, as you're sharing, I can't help but think of, a missions word we use all the time, and that's contextualization.
yes.
And, there's gospel truths that we hold unswervingly to. We can't let go of the truths because we compromise the Bible. We compromise
Yeah.
who Christ has revealed himself to be. But then there are these other things that, in a missions context, that we hold with an open hand. We use them to build bridges. We use them to, what's redeeming in the culture that we can use to build a bridge? What's present there that could be a link to a relationship? And so I just can't help but smile as we're having this conversation. We need to practice contextualization as we
Matthew,
see.
that's for the field. That's for the field side of the
Yeah, that's right. That's for the
Yes.
field. But we need
Yeah.
to practice contextualization. If I was a missionary, and by the way, on that note, my wife and I, when we first got married, we said, God, we'll go. We always want to be ready to go. That just hasn't happened. But as I've thought about in my mind going to the field, I'm not going to use programs. I might have a program that's a part of my toolbox,
Yeah.
but I'm going to build relationships. I'm going to
Mhm.
sit down and have coffee or tea. I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn. And as I hear you talking, maybe in some ways we have overcomplicated things and we need to demystify what it's going to take to mobilize the next generation,
Yeah.
which is that the fundamental principles of life, as Jesus revealed with his disciples, time
Mhm.
spent,
Yeah.
listening, learning, again, holding fast to the gospel truths, because we can't let go of these, and they're pushing up
Mhm.
against those,
Yeah.
and we need to have the courage to say no, that's not right, but
Yeah.
to be able to listen and learn in the other places. But anyway, just it strikes me as funny that we're talking about contextualization.
Yes, absolutely. I'll often, when I'm presenting in missions context, say we're used to getting off a plane or crossing a border and finding ourselves in a different culture, or going into a certain part of the community and finding ourselves in a different culture. But reality, what's happened today is the culture has shifted under our feet. So under our institutions, our organizations, our, country, the culture has shifted under our feet. And now we find ourselves in some ways in a foreign country. It's not just a generational gap, it's a cross-cultural gap as we think about navigating these generations. So what you're saying, Matthew, is absolutely right. It is just putting on that cross-cultural mindset. How do I contextualize in this culture
Mm-hmm.
for what we're wanting to say and do?
How about in this area of technology? I mean, I would say I don't know if would you call it the first generation that was born in the
Yeah.
mobile era, and therefore, like, they've just been totally soaked in social media and instant connections with other people, etc. It's got to be a
Yeah.
huge factor.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The internet, was born in the early 90s, to mid 90s. And so really this is the generation that's grown up. iPhone in 2007, iPad in 2010. So, I mean, they were not even adolescents before we got interactive technologies. So they are a generation where this is just a natural part of who they are and how they're connecting.
Well, could you just talk a little bit on what you hear regarding colonialism? Because I'd say that's a critique, or that's a reason
Mm-hmm.
people are not doing mission. They see missions as
Mhm.
colonialistic. Have you come across that in your research?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I would say that that is definitely a factor as they're considering doing anything overseas. That is a factor that they're having to navigate as they're talking with peers, as they're talking with teachers, parents, etc. Like, what about this element of it, the colonial nature of how we interpret missions in the past? So it's something that they're navigating. But what I find is that when young people are actually having the opportunity to engage with global workers in authentic relationship, they understand the heart behind it. So the more we can give them the story, the real story that's unfolding even now, that ties to the story of the past, we know that there have been failures and flaws in the past. And there have also been successes. At the same time, we know that there could be failures and flaws going forward. And as a generation growing up in a cancel culture, it's one of their fears. They do not want to participate in something that is flawed or going to cause harm. It's also part of their fear of missing out, right? They don't want to miss out on something successful while doing something harmful. And so if we can engage them in the story and the experience of what God is doing globally, it really helps mitigate that because they see the authentic relational connections that are occurring. I would say the other piece that's really, really important is to be able to have honest conversations about this. The more we can have the honest conversations about what have been some of the flaws or failures of the past and how do we learn from those, and then also to say what have been the successes of the past and how do we celebrate those, because sometimes they're being taught to just look for the failures in a cancel culture versus celebrating the successes.
Mhm.
So we really need to do both and then teach them that failure needs to be the launching point for growth and learning. So how do we learn and grow in order to do what God's calling us to do better going forward? So just that really story and experience, authentic relationship with global workers today, as well as having those honest conversations can really help mitigate those concerns that are real and very present there and that they're wanting to discuss.
So you've hit on some of the approaches just now: listening, authentic relationships, being honest
Mhm.
about what's happened historically, the positive, the negative, these type of things. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about the unique contributions that Gen Z can bring to the Great Commission today. You
Yeah.
talked about that they're special. How do we
Yes.
identify those pieces?
hmm Well, so going back to the technology, they are a generation that has grown up globally aware. They might not know what's going on with their neighbor, but they know what's going on the other side of the world because they're so connected virtually. So many of them are actually gaining an awareness of what's happening globally through Instagram and YouTube and watching global workers who are posting updates. So they see how technology can be leveraged to build awareness as well as how they're gaining awareness. So I think this is a tool that can really be leveraged. They also see the potential of things like AI to, move the mission of God forward in different ways. So I think they're bringing some innovative ideas, and they're willing to try new things. One of the things I often say is we have to stop saying can't and we've got to start asking how. They are willing to ask how. How do we solve this challenge? Because they know there are so many tools and resources at their disposal today that we have not had in the past. So that would be one thing. The other thing is, as a result of this global awareness, they do have high empathy, which ties into that wanting to include everyone and valuing diversity. So as a result of that, they are very effective cross culturally. When I'm talking to global workers from other countries, they indicate we love working with young millennials and Gen Zers because they're coming in wanting to know how do we collaborate and work together from the moment they get there because they have that disposition of empathy, including everyone. And so they're really positioned to be collaborative in this polycentric leadership environment that we're moving towards. And so this is where I see God truly designing each generation for their moment of leadership. And I think Gen Z has some of those characteristics. The other thing that I'll say is because they are coming out of a context where family, definitions of family, experiences of family are changing. They have high value on family and personal well being. And so they're really emphasizing relationships over task, as they're thinking about how do we care for ourselves so we avoid burnout and bitterness? How do we care for our families, our kids, our spouses? How do we care for our teammates? So this, just that empathy kind of overflows then too into the well-being and just a high priority on that. So I see them wanting to gain the skills to thrive long term in missions and ministry, to thrive, not survive. They want to thrive long term in ministry. And I think that's a really valuable quality as well.
Well, as we kind of wrap up here, I would say one thing that I've been telling myself and that I've just observed is, we'll often be exposed to crazy stuff on, let's say, Twitter, X, and it's easy for someone in an older cohort to look at that and say, oh, there's Gen Z. But there's plenty of healthy Gen Z Christians in the church today. And we got to be careful not to do what I talked about in the beginning, which is to think, well, God's going to just skip over a generation. And it really comes out in what you're talking about, that there's reason for incredible optimism here.
Yeah, I like to say that God always uses the unlikely to do the most unlikely. You're hard pressed to find in Scripture someone who God used in a powerful way who is not the most unlikely person to be used. And we look at Gen Z and we can say there's so many things that could make them feel like an unlikely candidate to be used by God. And that's why God is going to use them in such a powerful, powerful way, in unlikely ways to accomplish what other generations have not accomplished, because he is going to get the glory as they press into him. In a post-Christian, post-modern, post-missions context, God is raising up a generation who's going to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And that's really exciting to me.
Jolene, I love the optimism. I love it. And I know it's encouragement to me and to Ted and our listening and viewing audience. I can't help but think of Peter. The religious leaders saw an unschooled, ordinary fisherman who wasn't worth a second glance.
Yeah.
And of all the disciples, he had foot and mouth disease. I mean, the guy just had some real issues. And yet he's the rock, so to speak, that Jesus builds his church on. And I think we need to pray for vision. God, help us to see this generation through your eyes. And as you already hit on, when he uses the most unlikely of instruments to do the most magnificent work, the instruments never get the credit. It's always God. When the Pharisees saw these unschooled ordinary fishermen, what did they take note of? They had been with Jesus.
Yeah.
They had this courage and boldness. And the thing that was noteworthy was they'd been with Christ. That's what they took note of. And so what a great opportunity we have, as you mentioned, Jolene, but it's going to take time. I think we need to emphasize it's not going to be quick fix. Just to sharing the gospel in foreign contexts is not open package mix ingredients. It takes time.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of emotional investment, time, energy, emotional investment, prayer. But I do think we have an opportunity to steward what God has put in this generation, right? And it's going to require, like you said, contextualizing some of these things that we've done differently in the past. But it is a powerful opportunity to steward what God has placed here for such a time as this.
Amen.
So, Jolene, I understand you have a fairly recent book. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Mobilizing Gen Z, I wrote that with Katie White, and it just kind of talks through some of these things we've talked about here today, but really unpacks them in further detail. Probably my favorite part about the book is in the appendix, there is just a list of coaching questions, where if you're engaging young people in whatever context, they're just good questions to ask them to help them process how God may be calling and directing their lives. So, yeah.
We live in exciting, tumultuous times, but they're going to be met by an exciting, tumultuous generation. And just a great overall message. Thank you, Jolene. Appreciate you being with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jolene.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Essler, president of Missio Nexus.